podcast editing is a form of therapy because it requires mindfulness. You can't do it without being mindful. There are certain activities that you can do and the obsessions can live on in your brain. I can drive and still obsess. I can rake leaves or cut the grass and still obsess. Editing a podcast, editing a video, being on a tennis court, being in a conversation with someone where you actually have to actively listen to what they're saying to understand them. Those are practices that snap you out of the thoughts that you're in and into a different frame of mind.
Welcome to Magic in the Moment, Mindfulness in Real Time. My name is Clayton Platt, and I'll be your host for this podcast journey. Now, for many people, practicing mindfulness has very little to do with sitting on a cushion, lighting incense, or even focusing on their breath. Just paying attention to what they're doing at any moment, and doing this intentionally, can create that same magic. Our time together is intended to share how mindfulness plays out in everyday life for our guests. Now, before we begin, here's a word from our sponsor, Meditation for Leadership. We all feel it, the pressure to keep up, to perform, to push through. But lasting success doesn't come from speeding up. It comes from slowing down, leaning in, and creating the space to lead from within. That space is where we shift from autopilot to intention, building mindful habits that strengthen focus and calm. It's where we stay connected to our values and purpose, choosing to respond instead of react. It's where we unlock our potential to positively shape our own lives and empower others to grow and thrive. That's the work of Meditation for Leadership. If you're ready to create the space for sustainable success, visit meditationforleadership.org. Welcome to Magic in the Moment, Mindfulness in Real Time. I'm Clayton Platt, your host. Every episode of this show starts the same way for you, the listener. You press play, and a finished conversation magically appears. It's shaped. The music rises right on cue. The pauses sit where they should, and the moment that mattered rises to the top. But that's not how it starts for me. It starts as about 70 raw minutes of two people talking, sometimes me stumbling over a name that I should know how to pronounce by now, starting over a sentence because the first version wasn't quite right, and every so often a full do-over because my winged dog Brody decided that this was the perfect moment to bark at the mail carrier. Somewhere between that raw recording and what you actually hear or see, someone's sitting with it, alone, listening and watching closely, deciding what stays, what goes, where the real moment is hiding, adding the music, stitching in the intro, the outro, the sponsor read, and doing it so seamlessly you'd never know where my voice ends and the production begins. That someone is my producer, Jon Goehring of StoryTrust Media. And he's been inside almost every episode of this show, not as a guest, but as the person who's heard me think out loud, stumble and start over more than anyone else on the earth, including possibly my wife. Recently, Jon told me something that really resonated with me. He said that in the middle of editing, cutting, listening, re-listening, he keeps running into moments of mindfulness. Not because he's trying to, but because the work itself keeps putting him there. So today, I wanted to flip the microphone around. No guest pitch, no book to promote, no framework to teach. Just two people talking honestly about what this work has actually taught him about being present. So let's begin. Jon, I am so thrilled to have you here.
Clayton, thank you for having me here. I'm just honored to be a guest on the show that I've had the opportunity to work so hard on. So I'm so excited that you invited me on and grateful.
I know that, among other things, not only are you a fabulous producer, but you have your own podcast, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first and foremost, I want to ask a question which I haven't asked you yet. So this is real time. So how did you end up doing this for a living? What pulled you towards this world?
It was the power of storytelling. And as a young child that I knew that right away. And there were different ways to tell stories back then. 15, 20 years ago, newspapers were still a thing. Writing was my first love, and that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I would write pretend articles and stories or report on sporting events that were happening. And that was my first love. I realized how powerful stories are because stories transcend concepts or they transcend bullet points. A story connects with you more than any of those things. So I learned that from a very young age. And then as I went off to college, I knew that I wanted to tell stories in some medium. The question was just what medium? And as newspapers gave way to, for me, it was radio. That's what I first went into in college. I worked for the student radio station and from there got an internship in radio and ended up getting a job in radio. And that was the place I could tell stories, to now podcasting, which I believe is the skills that I learned from radio are so transferable to. That's how I got in. It was the power of stories, but really the method through which they're being told changes, but nothing fundamental about that is any different.
Yeah, that whole sense of the power of storytelling, it is so critical to how we learn, right? And we
Yeah.
don't learn by the raw edge of pedagogy, not right. We learn actually by the emotional connect of the story. I love that. And I'm not surprised that you got your start in radio. That's influenced you. Someone close to me has spent his entire life in radio, my brother. And I think
Really?
back and I think what appealed to him was very much in the same way with you. It was music was driving him,
Mm.
but that sense of being able to tell the story of the musician, of the composer, and all that. So that's awesome. And StoryTrust Media, you work with a lot of different podcasters. And what can you describe? What's the range of the shows that you work on? Because they're not, most of them aren't about mindfulness in real time.
No, that's the beautiful uniqueness of this show. But really, the idea of Story Trust Media was the concept that the stories that we tell, they build trust more than just concepts. And so that's the idea of our podcast production services, are basically trying to bring stories of people to life and help promote their brands and them as experts in their field. And so usually, at least my average client, I would say, is like a business coach or a sales coach or someone in the leadership and speaking world. You're unique, Clayton, but the show still has some overlap to some of the other shows that I work on, although it is the only mindfulness show. So it's really special in that way. But the main idea of it is that trust is currency. I believe that trust is currency. It's, if you trust someone more, you're more willing to work with them, refer them, have a more positive experience with them. But as soon as that trust erodes, that's when it all crumbles down. And so building that trust can happen in many ways. Obviously, the fastest way is through those face to face interactions, but we don't just want to build trust one to one in those interactions, but one to many. And that's the content that we share. And people trust you, Clayton, to show up every single day on social media with another piece of advice from a guest that you've had on or something from your own experience. And that just becomes a source of trust building, is that content that you put out there. So that's the idea behind Story Trust Media.
That thought of the foundation of our connections being built on trust is huge.
Yeah.
And the sense, and that's, I would say, quite honestly, that's one of the things that very much drew me to you when we were first introduced, was your approach to the work you do supporting people like me is authentic. And it's, let's work on presenting the best version of you and what you're trying to get across with your conversations with your guests, and not a lot of buzzers and whistles. And we're going to make this the most listened to and watched podcast in the world by doing things that aren't authentic. So no, let's focus on what you do that's real. And to me, I'm just going to say this flat out, I've really benefited from your reinforcement of stuff that you think lands and that listeners are really gravitating to. And the advice that you've given in terms of, we want to expand this, let's try that. And all of those pieces of advice have been based on how it relates to me and not simply, this is something I heard, maybe this will work. So what would work for Clayton in his life? So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the kind words. I'm so glad that the guidance that I've tried to give is helpful, and we want to keep growing the show, right? That's the goal.
Yeah,
And I
of
wish I
course.
had all the magic answers to that, but we keep working on it. And I love how you just continue to show up authentically. A lot of people, they lose their authenticity. I've seen this in the chase of something else, and that is, this is working for this person, therefore I can shed what makes me my authentic self and chase this because it's worked for this person. For example, right now, a big piece, and I know some of my clients do this, is that shocking, controversial statement, right? That's what gets the views and gets the attention. And that's not something that you seem too interested in doing because you're not the most controversial guy. You're not like a guy who's going to go out and say, you know what, everything about mindfulness that you've been taught is wrong. Now, that could be tempting because that hook is strong. That hook would be strong and would probably get more views, but it sacrifices your own authenticity. So I think being authentic is more trust building than chasing raw vanity statistics, because honestly, I'd rather have 100 people following the show who are committed, invested, and trust you than
Yeah.
10,000 views or downloads that are just vanity because the hook was great.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Somewhere in the middle wouldn't hurt.
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
No,
We'll keep
I'm just,
working on it.
we will. But one of the things that I think is really valuable about you personally in your role with me is that you actually sit on both sides of the mic, right? Because you have your own podcast. So you're going through this whole journey yourself. And I think that also is lends itself greatly to identifying and with your clients who are podcasters, and you can say with great truth, I know where you're sitting, I know what you're experiencing, right?
I think the fundamental for any sort of business is we have to remember that it's just simply solving a problem. It's just simply providing a solution to someone else's problem. And that's how I like to strip it all back and go back to the basics and think of my podcast production that way. And we all have this problem. Anyone who wants to be an industry expert in some area has the problem of visibility and content creation. That's something that's expected of all of us now. We have to show up and show up everywhere and show up consistently and on brand. And those are the problems that I solve. But I wanted to make sure that before I was able to go out and solve them for other people and help other people solve them, that I solve them for myself. And that's the idea of two podcasts that I am involved with. The StoryTrust Media podcast is my more generic, more podcast production based podcast, basically a podcast about podcasting and about
Okay.
content creation, which is a lot of fun to do. And that fuels the content that I put out on social media. And it's what I call my content creation engine, is that podcast. And then I work with people and try to implement that same idea of your podcast is a great way to repurpose and create content for everything, newsletters, social medias, etc. And then the other podcast that I host is called the Limitless Leadership Lounge, and we bring on leaders from all walks of life and leaders who have had success in all different areas. And that podcast is all about learning from some of the all-time greats, right? And then also the power of networking too, and having some of those people come into our world, my co-host and I, is a really powerful thing. Being able to, yeah, have those podcasts under my belt and constantly learn and experiment and be able to do it with my own show and then pass on advice based on what I've been able to either fail at or find some success in. I think that's a really big key to it.
Yeah, I have listened to a number of your podcasts, and one of the things that's really impressed me is how gifted you are, again, on that side of the mic. So, blessings for your taking the time to help people look better, sound better, and have their work distributed the best you can. But you're doing an amazing job as a host yourself. So, kudos for that. And I
Well,
wanted to
thank you.
share with you, and you know this because when I first met you, I had told you this. You weren't my first producer.
That's right. Yeah.
And I want to talk about that because it's actually an important element for me in the journey in many respects in mindfulness of working with someone that you respect and that you want to support. And my first producer was young, talented, was part of a community that I wanted to support. And one of the things that I realized was she was stretched way too thin. She was trying to do way too much. And despite her best intentions, couldn't give me the attention that the show needed. And it was really hard for me to make that change because I felt some loyalty and then I felt disloyalty stepping away. And yet, that's one of the things that mindfulness teaches us, that you need to look at this kind of choice and bring awareness to it. And in that awareness, say, will this ever change? What evidence do you have that this person whose intentions are to serve you, but it's not working, that will change? And if it doesn't change, then I have to make a decision around that. And the awareness plus the decisions, that choice equals results. And for me, that has been hugely impacted. My sense of professionalism and my sense of confidence in terms of the things are going to be done on time, they're going to be done to my fullest expectations, has been lived up to. So I want to really thank you for that. And when you came on, what might you have noticed right away about the show as it was already running that might have needed some attention?
I think it was just the polish of it overall. Obviously, the content is great. You have amazing guests on. You talk about such important topics. But we have to remember that in podcasting, we're using some of our audience's time, right? And time is our most precious asset, even more than our financial treasure, right? And I find as a podcaster, the importance of respecting someone's time. And one of the ways to do that is actually polishing your show and making it a tight, finished product. And I'm not saying your show wasn't. I'm just saying that I think there was room for improvement in that area. And hopefully I've been able to bring some of that more polish. And all right, we're gonna tighten it up a little bit. Not because we want to strip away the authenticity of the conversation, but because every podcast episode is a promise. And every time someone sees the title and maybe the beginning of the description of the podcast episode, or here's the first 30 seconds of what it's going to be about, that's a promise from the host, from that podcaster, to the audience member, saying, here's what you're going to take away from this episode. Here's what you're going to learn. You're going to be inspired. You're going to be entertained, whatever the purpose of the podcast is, right? And it's important. It's one of the trust building tactics that we have as podcasters, that we live up to that promise and that we deliver that promise. And even better if we can do it while making the most and respecting the time of the audience. I think a lot of podcasters have this idea that they're the star of the show and everybody's showing up to listen and watch them, right? And obviously, Clayton, you're the star of this show, man. This is all about you, right? But no, it's actually not. It's about what they're going to get from the show, how they're going to benefit. Why do they listen? Maybe because they like you, and that's an important piece of it, but you're not trying to win over disciples. You're trying to benefit and touch lives. That's why we should really be getting into what we're doing. The important thing for me is working with people who are aligned with me. I don't see eye to eye on everything with everybody that I work with, but at the same time, there are certain topics or podcasts that I won't work with, and certain ones that aren't good fits. And that doesn't mean I can't support them in other ways and wish them the best and all that, but I think it's just so important to find that alignment. And I definitely had that with the concept of mindfulness early on.
What I have felt has been that element of the lifting up of the polished final product as evidence of trying to keep the promise of giving you the listener, the greatest bang for their time, so to speak. And also, it has been a reminder to me, it's like, okay, I like to have the organic conversations like we're having today. It's not scripted. I don't have 1,000 questions written out, but also coming back to that sense of what's most helpful. I remember, this is a typical deviation, but I think this is a good time for it. I love to tell sometimes stories which are more interesting than helpful. And my kids have been known at the dinner table to raise their hand and say, Dad, can we go back to helpful? And I think for a podcast host, remembering that there are times of, yeah, let me take this in a different direction, which is no, this is let's reinforce the key points and stay as much on the topic that supports, for example, the points that the guest is making. As you said, it's like this, it's Clayton's podcast, but Clayton is not the star. And in the training world, I love this. We look at ourselves as a facilitator of a corporate training program, and we are the guide on the side and not the sage on the stage. And that's something I try to remember. Hey, sometimes you got to edit it out, buddy, but in general, that's been my go. And I want to take the next thing, because this is one of the reasons why I was so excited to have this conversation with me. You had talked about sometimes in the editing process, it's like something would happen. You go, oh, that's a reinforcement of something that I do in life. Or this just being in the process of listening, watching, and deciding what needs to stay or go, that you really need to be in the moment for that. And you brought that up to me, and I wonder if you would share with me how that arose for you and what it felt like.
Yeah, editing is not formulaic. A lot of people would think podcast editing is as simple as, well, now with AI, we can plop a transcript into AI and AI can help us decide what to keep and leave. Look, there are great uses of AI when it comes to editing, and I don't avoid AI in the editing process completely, but there's nothing quite like sitting with a podcast episode from the perspective of somebody who's listening, not just reading the transcript and saying, this is a good point, this should stay, this should go, but actually sitting and just being with it. And I found myself getting so deeply entrenched with some of the episodes that you've had and some of the guests that you've had on, that there are things that I would normally have taken out if I was just reading the transcript that I left in just because of the flow, just because of there's something about that when you're in the moment with a podcast episode that you just know. It's just this intuitiveness of that needs to be heard by someone. I don't know who, but that needs to be heard by someone. And there are certain concepts and certain stories that people tell, certain little pieces of it that you wouldn't be able to just edit without actually listening through to it. So I've found that my podcast editing journey has been a practice of mindfulness in and of itself, because of the importance of sitting with some of the points that are made, understanding, okay, even if that point, I remember one of your guests one time made a point that I didn't quite agree with. And I remember hearing it, and overall it was a good episode. I agreed with most of it, but this one point I was like, this is bugging me. And my instinct was, cut that out. Nobody needs to hear that. And I had to sit with myself and go, Jon, this is a valuable thing for the audience to hear. They can make their own conclusions. I'm not here to be the decider of what stays and goes based on my own personal opinions. And I think that's a key piece of it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but overall the show has definitely helped with my own mindfulness.
What you just said really does answer in many respects what I was pondering, because that example you gave to me really underscores something that I've used in my teaching a lot, which is the awareness of sometimes just the relationship, and in this case, what the overall conversation and flow of that podcast episode had to say versus that one point. Sometimes it's so much more important to allow that to happen than to be right. I use that all the time with relationships with a partner or children. Just what's more important? And in that case, what I hear from you is in the whole flow of things, I may have disagreed with that, but this is part of a larger mosaic and it needs to be heard in its entirety. So I may be personally know that I have a different point of view that's more correct in this thing, but I'm going to let this fly. And as a parent and as a partner or a spouse, there are times when I got to draw the line in the sand. Is that really helpful? What ultimately do you want? And I appreciate that. So that I think that's a perfect example.
Do you want to be right? Like this, yeah, you talk about, boy, a few years of marriage has taught me this, that's for sure. Do I want to be right, or do I want to build the relationship?
And that's really hard to give up. And it takes an awful lot of awareness. And I give you a lot of credit for that. And I think that to me is like, because I do a little bit of my own editing, not necessarily so much with this, but sometimes with other things. And it's okay if I'm editing me, go for it, right?
Right.
But it's a whole different thing when you're editing someone else.
That's true.
And I'm thinking about then editing from a technical standpoint, or let's think about editing from a relationship standpoint, right? Where we go, don't come to me with that, or I don't want to hear that, or wow, that can really shut down the ability to hear the full thing of what someone needs, right? And not to get too broad about it, but it speaks volumes about where we are culturally. It's like we edit the people we disagree with.
Yes, and we edit our feeds to only serve as echo chambers for our own belief systems. And that's a really tricky thing. Why are we put on this earth? I believe it's more out of the concept of love and the love thy neighbor, right? Not prove thyself right, but love thy neighbor. And sometimes you have to sit with something that's a little bit uncomfortable. And that's the power of being mindful with that, because that can either challenge your point of view or even strengthen your point of view, because you get to double down on what you believe because it's been challenged, or maybe it shifts it a little bit because you hear a different perspective. But it's the beauty of, and it's a credit to you as well, of the different types of guests that you've brought on this show that all bring value. It's not like you're pulling random people and pulling them onto the show. They all bring value related to mindfulness, but from so many different walks of life. And that challenges our perceptions and our preconceived notions about it.
That's so true. And I appreciate that. And I want to shift, if I can. This is such an interesting conversation for me, and I really appreciate it. I want to shift because one of the things that you reminded me of before we started our conversation was that from a personal standpoint, moving away from the professional, you have some challenges that you deal with, and some of the work that we do around mindfulness and being present, etc., plays into, generally speaking, some of the tools and techniques that you need personally to deal with it. And I want to let you share if you feel comfortable doing so.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I share about this a lot because I think it's so important right now. We're in a mental health crisis, and a lot of people don't really know what that means. And I think it means different things to everyone, and everyone's experience with mental health is legitimate in their own way. But for me, it's obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. And a lot of people think, oh, OCD, I'm so OCD, that you hear that thrown around a lot. And quite honestly, it's mildly insulting because it's just, yeah, okay, you don't have OCD, believe me, you would know if you did. OCD, you picture people washing their hands obsessively or organizing things like neat and tidy. And ask my wife, I am not a very organized person. But really, the concept of OCD is you have obsessions and you have compulsions. You have intrusive thoughts that won't go away, that you obsess over, negative fears, whatever the case is. And then you have compulsions to try to make yourself feel better about those things. For example, I'm obsessing, the classic one would be cleanliness. I'm obsessing that maybe I'll get sick, and I can't handle that thought of maybe getting sick. And so in order to alleviate that obsession, I will perform the compulsion of washing my hands constantly over and over again until it literally, you don't do anything else in life because you're so obsessed with it. And so you perform that compulsion. That's basically the basics of OCD. So for me, it hits you in different ways throughout your life. I've been obsessed with various things. At its worst, I was obsessed with suicide. I was obsessed with this concept of can I trust that I'll never kill myself? And
Mm.
I could not get past that thought of I had seen someone tragically take their own life, not seen in person, but I had heard about it, somebody that I knew, and then I just couldn't get past that. How do I know I won't do that? And I never wanted to
Mm.
do it. And that was the therapy that I eventually had to go through was the concept of, John, you suicidal people don't think the way you're thinking, but I could never get far enough away from it. So I would
Mm.
perform compulsions by checking with people. You don't think I'm going to kill myself, right? And I would just random strangers, I would ask that question. I'd be so obsessed about it. And that's why I needed therapy for it. And I still have benefited so much from therapy because it latches on to other areas in life. And I've gotten the whole I'm terrified of getting sick obsession as well. And it's a real struggle, but tying it all back to mindfulness, the key to getting over OCD, naturally you think it's to perform more compulsions, right? Because you have to be more and more sure. But really, it's to be mindful within the obsessions, and that is to let them happen without combating them with compulsions. And that's such an counterintuitive thing. Be able to
Yeah.
sit in uncertainty and let it pass by, and those thoughts pass by on their own. But as soon as you perform a compulsion, you train your mind that you need to perform the compulsion to get over the obsession, and then you keep having to go back to the well of compulsions again and again.
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, I'm so grateful for your sharing that. Your willingness to be open and vulnerable about it is hugely helpful, I'm sure, to a lot of people listening to, first of all, understand a little better about what OCD is, but also understanding that the human condition is, by its very nature, imperfect. And it's, I don't want to marginalize anybody's struggle at all, but everybody has some level of struggle. So recognizing that, but then being able to say, look, there's nothing inherently embarrassing about being a human. So let me share this and some of the ways that I've tried to navigate it and benefited from the therapy, et cetera, but also some of the making it, humanizing it, right? And that element that you talked about, the obsessive thoughts, I think most people have mind chatter of some sort, and it doesn't always end up to the extent that it does, that it would for someone with OCD, where it can be almost paralyzing, but it interferes with our ability to live our lives the way we want, to make good decisions, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because that voice in our head is saying to this, or you suck at this, or you shouldn't do this, or that's dangerous. And we like to say from the mindfulness standpoint that those thoughts are real, but they're not true. And what you talked about, saying we can't just suppress them, we can't just make them go away. So if we
Right.
acknowledge that we have that voice in our head that is happening, but that we don't have to believe the story, over time, that can help it lose its power and allow us then to make better decisions based on what would be reality versus the fictional. It's like, John, people who've killed themselves and they've taken their lives, and that's a possibility for you. And you're going,
Mm.
oh, why couldn't it happen to me? It can, but not necessarily, and it's not a given. And that's really hard to get to that point. As you said, it's like the concept of letting those thoughts slowly dissipate and go into the background, like we say, like clouds moving through the sky, right?
Yeah.
It's a very simple concept, but it's not easy. And I've shared with people before, when I sit on my cushion and I'm trying to sit for 30 minutes, and many times I'm not, all I'm doing is just following my breath, feeling my body, and I will have 150 intrusive thoughts at the least. So it's happening to me even after all this time. But it's the realization that the more I work at it, the more I will identify that's an intrusive thought,
Yeah.
and I don't have to follow it. It's not magic. It's not going to work every single time, but I make fewer quick knee-jerk decisions based on that than I did before I started meditating.
And that's the power of meditation in that sense. And that's, yeah, being on the cushion is very helpful in that way. And I think mindfulness shows up in these everyday moments in life. And when you have anxiety, OCD, which is my brand of anxiety, right?
Yeah.
It's the power of making sure that you have opportunities to be mindful, because what we want to do is compulse, if that's a word, perform
Yeah.
compulsions, right?
Right.
It's the idea of the more compulsions I can perform, the more safe I feel. So naturally
Mhm.
we start retracting from society, saying, I got to perform these compulsions. But the more we force ourselves to stay in the presence of others, that's mindfulness too. The more we force
Yeah.
ourselves to do activities that we enjoy, even if at that moment we're not enjoying them, because we have this urge to look up statistics about suicide and try to make myself feel better that I probably won't be one of them. I have this urge to do that, and it's just bugging me. I don't even want to do a fun thing like play tennis. Force yourself to do that fun thing because it opens up an opportunity for mindfulness. That's the key piece for me. And I think for a lot of people with anxiety, even though it feels so
Yeah.
counterintuitive. And then meditation, when you're sitting on that cushion, it's inevitable that you're going to get that, right? That you're going to get all those thoughts, but you just
Yeah.
continue to get better and better at it. I'm sure people probably have asked you, wow, you must have it all together because you're able to meditate for 30 minutes, right?
Yeah. Or when I'm on retreat, it could be 45 minutes or an hour. It's like, how do you do this? With a lot of discomfort.
Yes. And it's not like you're perfect. People think that means you're perfect, that you don't have a single intrusive thought throughout that total meditation. And I feel like that's a lie too.
Yeah, it's a total lie. It's a total lie. And that's to me, so from a meditation standpoint, I want to swing back to some of the tools that you use that may not be sitting on a cushion, right?
Sure.
But for me, that works for me, getting that commitment to every day meditate. And it's as often as I can, it's on the cushion for 30 minutes, but sometimes it's 10 minutes outside on the deck, or sometimes it's 5 minutes before I go to bed, but it's that commitment to do it. In the end run, what I've seen over time is those little incremental improvements in pausing before I react.
Hmm.
And that's a lot of what you're talking about. It's like that sacred pause before we go to start looking up the statistics about suicide, or before we run for that bottle of wine, or before we do something else, we go start scrolling again for the 85th time in the last hour. Finding that moment, recognizing, oh, you feel it. And that's the other thing is, can you feel those obtrusive thoughts physically? Because there's a trigger that most of us, if we pay attention, we can feel the body talking to us. Ooh, right? And as soon as we feel that, it's not our first rodeo. Okay,
No.
I know what's coming next. I'm going to make a choice. If we can have that pause. And for you, what are there specific techniques that have helped you take that pause?
Yes, it's all about changing the relationship with your thoughts. And that's exactly what you said. So, accountability is everything. Having an accountability partner. So, for me, it's like my wife, because it could be anybody, but my wife, because she's around me probably the most. And so, it's the, hey, I just had this thought. I'm having these intrusive thoughts right now, and she knows what to do. She knows not to reinforce, cuz the natural reaction from any well-meaning person would be, "Oh, no, it's okay. The chances of that bad thing happening to you are so small." That's not what the OCD brain is looking for. The OCD brain thinks that's what it needs, but what it actually needs is to accept the slight chance that bad thing that you're thinking could happen might happen, but is it worth spending so much time and the quality of your life dramatically suffering because you think you can prevent it when you really won't? you can't do anything to prevent it anyway. So
Mm.
that's the key piece for me. That number one tool I think is accountability, just getting with other people, because we're so in our own minds. And I think this is relatable, not just to someone with a diagnosed mental health condition, but anybody, right? Is why do we start ruminating more when we're lying in bed trying to fall asleep? It's because there's nobody else around us, right? It's because we're stuck in our own thoughts. When we are with other people, we're not so in our own minds, right? Those ruminations can continue. And believe me, they do with OCD when you're around other people. But we pick up on others' cues. And this is something that one of your previous guests, Michael Platt, your
Mm.
namesake, also
Yeah.
brought up, is that idea of synchronicity, right? And I don't know all the neuroscience behind that. I find that absolutely fascinating. And I recommend people go back and check out that episode because for more details on that, but how people are in sync when they're performing a similar activity, right? But just being around others, there's something super special about that, and something that opens up an opportunity for mindfulness when you're with someone else, listening to their story, performing an activity with them, cooking with them, shopping with them,
Mm.
whatever it is. I know that's not a magic pill that we're all looking for. I know that's not the mindfulness tools that we normally hear, or these tricks, these clickbait tricks that we think are going to fix us fast, but it's the tools that's worked for me.
Yeah. I love that. Because it's the real time. It's what can I do in this very moment, right? And in this very moment, it could be one, turn to my wife, mention to her, this is what's happening. And she knows she's a great partner, as you're saying, your wife to turn and say, you know what, remember, John, yes, there are statistics that this is possible. But in the meantime, we can wash some dishes. We can do some gardening, right?
Yeah.
Let's do something right now which is practical as opposed to compulsive. And okay, okay, I can. Let's go for a walk. Let's play tennis. Whatever it is that brings you back. And I think that's the thing when I talk to people about. There's a difference between, for example, when I'm walking Brody, whether I'm listening to podcast, okay, I do that frequently, or I'm walking with him and I'm just watching him and I'm not mind wandering. And there's nothing inherently wrong with mind wandering. Sometimes great ideas come up, but that is in itself not being in the moment. Okay. Again, it doesn't mean mind wandering is bad, but if your purpose is to try to be present and you're walking your dog, then it's, oh, why don't he's sniffing? It's like, oh, that's so fascinating. What is for him so interesting about that? And, okay, so okay, now he's ready to walk. Okay, well, he stopped. What is he listening to? What is, and in that moment, all your concentration is on him. And what you're saying is like when you're on the tennis court, you're doing everything you can to be there with the flow and hitting the ball, being with the ball, as opposed to, oh my God, if I miss this shot, I'm going to be down love 40, and that's I'm
Mhm.
never going to be able to dig out of that. No, right now, I have one job: put the ball in play.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. And I've thought of it this way. I've never heard of someone who has regretted in their life being too present. You ever
Mm,
hear anybody say, I wish I wasn't so present? Like,
mm,
no, the regrets are always the opposite. I wish
yeah.
I didn't miss my kids growing up because I was so obsessed with work. Or I wish I
Mm,
didn't miss this particular moment or this vacation because of fear of how something would turn out. Nobody's ever regretted being too mindful. And so I don't know, the human condition, for whatever reason, that's not our first instinct to be mindful, to watch Brody during the walk. Our first instinct is to wander and to think, oh, what
yeah.
I got to get done today? What about all the, we have this bias toward the negative, this bias towards the what if. And could that protect us in some cases? Sure, it could, at least back in the day, and maybe some
Yeah.
cases even today, but it doesn't serve us in so many ways.
Yeah. And it did thousands of years ago. It served us because we didn't have the time to think through, for example, is that a stick or a snake, or
Yeah.
can I outrun that saber-toothed tiger? It was just like, get the F out of here, right?
Yeah.
And that's how we were wired. So there's 5 times more real estate in our brains dedicated to noticing and moving away from threat than noticing and moving towards reward. And it's because of that. That's how our species survived. But in today's world, that's not so helpful. And so we need to have those other things that you and I've been talking about that guide us towards noticing when we're not in the moment and remembering the power of being present. And sometimes just sitting with that sometimes when, and I'm thinking about this, I got this text from a daughter-in-law today about Father's Day. And it was so sweet and so authentic. And I just sat with that for a few minutes and just let that resonate. The feeling of oxytocin waving over me, picturing her face, and just going, that's beautiful. And I'm so glad that she married my son. And one of the things she was talking about was like, oh, you've helped guide this wonderful young man that I'm married to. I'm like, wow, did I really? Okay. So that's what I'm saying is the power then of being just with that and not rushing off to send a response, but letting that sit for a little bit and then feeling the embodiment of that joy and that connection. Because the more that we do pay attention to how things show up in our bodies, that's where things show up first. We always think of our brain makes our body, no, our body reacts first, and then our brain interprets that.
That's
Right? And
critical.
yeah. So I think what you've brought to the table in terms of your particular dynamics, right? Which aren't my dynamics and aren't many people's dynamics, but they're real and they're a set of challenges for you. And you've faced it and said, what I'd like in life is to be able to navigate this particular set of obstacles in a way that won't always be perfect, but allow me to be more my best self more of the time. And whatever I can do, therapy has given you some tools
Yes.
and I'm sure the other elements, sometimes stuff that we get out of our religion, sometimes stuff that we get out of other relationships with people, and sometimes just feeling the sunlight on our shoulders.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a one size fits all solution for anybody. I'm somebody who's actually on a medication as well, and people have very differing opinions about that. But could OCD be caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain? A lot of doctors would argue that it is, and that's one of the reasons that I'm on that medication. To have served me well, I can't totally tell, but either way, just finding the solutions that are right for us and not trying to treat them as fixes. The big key in mindfulness too is it's not a fix. It's not go to therapy for however many weeks and do this program and be done. It's a journey and it's never stops. And that sounds exhausting to people. But it's actually freeing because it shows that you'll make mistakes. You'll get off track, but there never was a strict track for you to follow. And so for me, I'm in a really good space right now. I haven't had chronic obsessions for months, and I'm just so grateful for that. I know they could come back at any time, and I know that it's an on and off kind of thing, but I also know that the tools that are available, the therapy, the even work is to kind of tie this all the way back around. Podcast editing is a form of therapy because it requires mindfulness. You can't do it without being mindful. There are certain activities that you can do and the obsessions can live on in your brain. I can drive and still obsess. I can rake leaves or cut the grass and still obsess. And those are the activities that I am drawn to doing when I'm in that state of mind because I can still perform the compulsions, which are comfortable to perform because they bring immediate relief that is then just overshadowed by more fear. But because I can perform those compulsions while doing those things feel more comfortable because at least I can perform the compulsions. Editing a podcast, editing a video, being on the tennis court, being in a conversation with someone where you actually have to actively listen to what they're saying to understand them. Those are practices that snap you out of the thoughts that you're in and into a different frame of mind. And that's one of the reasons I love storytelling. One of the reasons I love editing podcasts and content for others, because it forces me into their mind, into their thinking, which is usually more sane than mine. So it's a matter of mindfulness in these everyday things for me. And sometimes it's obsessive thoughts, overwhelming, absolutely. I feel like I should probably go on a silent retreat somewhere and try to heal from this. But no, all I need to do is go to work. That's what I really need to do in that moment, because that's going to be mindfulness. The human brain's not good at multitasking. That's going to be the thing that forces me into mindfulness and out of the other thoughts that I'm having.
I can't think of a better way to complete our conversation. You've tied it beautifully back. You must have been involved with some podcasting for a while, good sir. But I'm going to ask before we close, Jon, I'm going to ask, is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you'd like to, and point out anything? Obviously, the two podcasts you're involved in, we'll make sure that there are links in the show notes. But is there anything else that you'd like to shout out before we close out today?
I just want to shout out all the guests, the previous guests on this show, who have done an amazing job of bringing this to life, as have you, Clayton. But the guests that I'm thinking of, I would have to go back and name them all to do them justice. But Ray Arata, Hans was amazing. You talk about Rich Rowe, who was absolutely fantastic recently. Kyan, with a last name that I can't pronounce. Kyan, was it Krippendorf or something?
Yes.
Krippendorf. Okay.
Kyan.
Yep. Absolutely phenomenal. These guests have brought so much value to the show, and it's so cool to listen to their stories and to how they use mindfulness. It's totally rewriting what we think of when we think of mindfulness and meditation, because we think of just the cushion and the retreats and all that. But these guests showed that it's so much more. And then to you, Clayton, a big shout out to how what you're doing with this podcast. It's really what the world needs right now, because it's not something that's promoting another mindfulness retreat that you need in order to unsort all of your stress and reduce all of your anxiety. You're not proposing a one size fits all solution. You're just sitting with this concept and being curious and being able to listen. So that's the main thing that I want to shout out, is just this show and how it's been able to, I know, help many people, including myself, and I'm one of the ones working on it, navigate how mindfulness can be relevant in their daily lives, even if they don't meditate 30 minutes a day.
Yeah. I'm very grateful for that. And thank you for the shouts to the wonderful guests. And I've been incredibly blessed by that. So you are now among that pantheon of my favorite guests, Jon. So thank you so much. I appreciate all your support, and I look forward to many more episodes and hopefully years of working with you. So blessings to you, good friend.
Thank you so much, Clayton. You as well.
Hey, thanks for listening. I want to give a big shout out to Jon Goehring of StoryTrust Media for his expert editing and wonderful production guidance. I also am deeply grateful for the ongoing support I receive from Meditation for Leadership and their sponsorship. So that's all for now. Until next time, this is Clayton Platt saying, watch for those moments of magic when mindfulness shows up in real time in your life.